He is the author of many books. Some of them are out on the outside, and I presume that if someone buys them, Norm, you'll be happy to sign them. Received his doctorate in 1988 from the Department of Politics at Princeton. He taught for many years political theory and issues surrounding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, now primarily writes and lectures all over the country and all over the world. The author of 8 books that have been translated into 50 foreign editions. He is the son of Holocaust survivors. And his books, none of them with very provocative titles. Knowing Too Much, Why the American Jewish Romance with Israel is Coming to an End, that was 2 years ago. What Gandhi Says About Nonviolence, Resistance, and Courage, also 2 years ago. This Time We Went Too Far, Truth and Consequences of the Gaza Invasion, 4 years ago. Beyond Chutzpah, on the Misuse of Anti-Semitism and the Abuse of History, 2005. The Holocaust Industry, Reflections on the Exploitation of Jewish Suffering, 2000. Image and Reality of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, 1995. A Nation on Trial, The Goldhagen Thesis and Historical Truth, in 1998. And The Rise and Fall of Palestine, A Personal Account of the Intifada Years, in 1996. And not to outdo himself, he's working currently on a book with Palestinian political analyst Mouin Rabbani entitled How to Solve the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. Are we going to hear that tonight? I think I saw a nod of the head. Without any further ado, it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce to the stage, and Norm, there are steps over here. You don't need to go. Dr. Norm Finkelstein. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's always a pleasure to come to Colorado. Okay, I'll be speaking this evening on the most recent developments, namely the Kerry initiative, where it came from, what is its content, and what is its likelihood for success. It's quite possible that the Palestine conflict is at a crossroads. It's far from certain, but it's possible that under the auspices of Secretary of State John Kerry, a historic defeat will be inflicted on the Palestinians. Right now, it's very much up in the air, but one of the prudent things Kerry did was to begin the process 2 years into the Obama presidency, unlike his predecessors, to whom I'll refer in a moment, which gives him quite a lot of time to put all the pieces in place to enable the success, as he sees it, the success of his initiative. The Kerry initiative, if you were to go back a year ago, would have been impossible to predict. Nobody, so far as I know, including myself, nobody saw it coming. But in hindsight, it makes perfect sense. Kerry is not the first high-ranking American official who has sought to broker a settlement of the Israel-Palestine conflict. The cases most pertinent for our purposes this evening are, first of all, President Bill Clinton in 2000. His motive was pretty transparent. He was trying to remove from his legacy the stain of the Monica Lewinsky affair, and he thought by solving the Israel-Palestine conflict, he could somehow vindicate his legacy. He ultimately failed, but it's often forgotten just how close Clinton came to sealing a deal. It was only Yasser Arafat, the PLO chair, it was only his refusal at the last minute to go along with the terms that Clinton sought to impose. It was only his refusal that blocked the settlement in 2000. And Arafat paid a steep price for his refusal. When the negotiations had begun, President Clinton had made a promise to Arafat that if the negotiations didn't achieve a result, he wouldn't pin blame on any one side to the failure of the negotiations. Well, Clinton reneged on that promise and he scapegoated Arafat, the Palestinians themselves suffered a major setback in international public opinion from which they've not yet, even to this day, fully recovered. After Clinton in 2000, the next attempt that was made came in 2008 with Condoleezza Rice. She was tainted by association with George Bush's disastrous foreign policy, and she tried her hand also to vindicate her record. She tried her hand at trying to resolve the conflict. Condoleezza Rice was very close to Clinton, some say even romantically so. No, excuse me, with Bush. Basically, Bush gave her a free hand. He said to her, if you want to attempt to resolve the conflict, I'm not going to prevent you. And she had future career prospects, perhaps still does. And she was burdened with Bush's foreign policy record. And she tried, in many respects, it was a quite naive attempt on her part. For whatever you want to say about Clinton, he's an extremely smart man. And he had mastered all the details of the Israel-Palestine conflict. At a certain point, it was said, and I think it's probably true, he had memorized every street and alleyway in Jerusalem in trying to resolve the Jerusalem aspect of the conflict. Condoleezza Rice, judging by the internal record, which we have because it was released as part of what came to be called the Palestine Papers, a disgruntled Palestinian negotiator released the whole record. It was a quite enormous one. It ran to something like 15,000 pages, and it was extremely illuminating for those who took the trouble to read it. It was clear that Condoleezza Rice, at least in this particular issue, she was in over her head. At one point, she expressed astonishment when she was told that there was a water shortage in that area. And following in the footsteps of Clinton and Rice, now comes Secretary of State John Kerry. He's now faced with the shared legacy of President Obama's ridiculed foreign policy record, and he's hoping that he can resolve the conflict, maybe get himself a Nobel Prize, cap his own political career with that prize, and maybe even make another run for the presidency on the basis of it. The irony is that if Kerry has invested a huge quantum of time and energy, and if Obama has joined Kerry in this undertaking, and if they do succeed in ending the conflict, it will not be because a critical U.S. foreign policy interest is at stake. Quite the contrary, the principal impetus behind the U.S. initiative, as embarrassing as it might be to the President and his Secretary of State, and as deflating as it might be to the rest of us, the primary impetus is personal vanity. Like Clinton and Rice before them, Obama and Kerry seek historical vindication. As some of you might have noted when Kerry spoke last before one of the congressional committees, Senator McCain accused him of being a trifecta failure, and that's something that obviously weighs heavily on Kerry, and he's looking for some vindication somewhere, and it's certainly not going to be in Syria, over which he has pretty much zero control. It's not going to be in Iran, where things seem like they may be heading towards an impasse, and it's not going to be the Ukraine. So the only place where he can hope to vindicate himself is in Israel-Palestine, which suggests that he's going to apply a great deal of pressure to achieve the result. But it's mostly about vanity. It's mostly about vainglory. On the other hand, if you're the leader of a powerful state, vainglory, if it's harnessed to a powerful state, can have very significant consequences. Often there are negative consequences. What is Kerry trying to do? What is the content of the Kerry proposal? It's pretty clear. There are no surprises. And as a matter of fact, the people surrounding Kerry have said over and over again, and here I think you should take them at their word, they said there is no surprises about how the conflict is going to end, the terms they're proposing. The terms they're proposing are basically that, number one, Israel will annex what are called the major settlement blocks. That's about 75 to 80% of the illegal Jewish settlers in the occupied territories will be incorporated into Israel. The annexation will run along the lines of the wall that Israel has been building, which will annex about 10% of the West Bank, including some of the prime arable land and the critical water resources. It will trisect the West Bank, the major settlement block called Ma'ale Adumim. It stretches from Jerusalem almost to Jericho, bisecting the West Bank at the waist, and then the settlement blocks in the north, Ariel and Shamron, sometimes called the Two Fingers, they bisect the northern sector of the West Bank. And so for all intents and purposes, I hate that cliche, forgive me for using it, but the bottom line is the Palestinian, whatever is left of Palestinians, it will certainly not be sustainable over time. And at some point, the Palestinians will probably be forced into some sort of confederation with Jordan, because the state that, the quote-unquote state that Kerry is proposing is not going to be a viable state. And the other main Israeli demand, which Kerry is going along with, the other Israeli demand is the nullification of the right of return. The right of the Palestinian refugees to return under international law has been validated, but the terms of the Kerry plan will be to nullify the right of return, and there'll probably be some sort of an international commission organized to pay out some monies to the Palestinians, which probably in the end they'll never see. Basically what Kerry did was, it's perfectly obvious for anybody who's taken the time to study the details of the conflict. Basically what Kerry did was, he took the Israeli bottom line in previous negotiations. If you go back and look at the internal record of the Annapolis negotiations, the ones over which Condoleezza Rice presided, the Israeli bottom line was very clear. And at that point, it was Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni. She said that the wall is our final border. We're building the final border, and that's the wall. And so the two critical bottom line demands of the Israelis, actually consistently, at least since 2000, the two bottom line, the core demands of Israel were to keep the major settlement blocks, about 10% of the West Bank, and to nullify the right of return. Kerry was perfectly smart enough to recognize that if he's going to pull this off, he can't fight a war on two fronts. He can't battle with the Israelis and battle with the Palestinians. So he did exactly as what you would expect, namely, he took the Israeli side, took their bottom line demands, and then sought to impose it, and has sought to impose it on the Palestinians. The bottom line is for those who do this sort of accounting is, the bottom line is then all the critical questions bearing on the Israel-Palestine conflict, namely borders, settlements, Jerusalem, and refugees. On all the critical questions, Israel wins and the Palestinians will lose. Some people might find this kind of zero-sum game accounting to be a little, too black and white, but the fact of the matter is the Palestinians will get zero and Israel will get the sum, so it's zero-sum. All of this, incidentally, for those who care about these eccentric things like international law, all of this is completely in violation of international law. Under international law, the whole of the West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem, are occupied Palestinian territories designated for Palestinian self-determination. That was the opinion of the International Court of Justice in July 2004. Under international law, Palestinians have the right of return. That's not just the opinion of the UN General Assembly, it's the opinion of all the major human rights organizations in the world. If you look at the policy statements of Human Rights Watch, the policy statement of Amnesty International, they have all stated that under international law, it can't be doubted that the Palestinian refugees and succeeding Palestinian refugees from 1948 and 67 and succeeding generations that have maintained genuine links to the land, that they have the right of return. Now, everybody recognizes, and there's no point in being dogmatic about these things. Everybody recognizes that in politics there has to be some sort of compromises made. And the question then becomes what's a reasonable compromise and what's an unreasonable compromise. So let's take the question of the settlements and the borders. In 2008, at those Annapolis negotiations, the Palestinians made what seems to me has to be called a reasonable compromise. They said to the Israelis, we're going to allow you to keep 60% of the settlers, 60%. At that point, there were about 500,000 settlers in the occupied Palestinian territories. Now the figure is up to about 560,000. But they said, we'll let you keep 60% of the settlers, and we have a map, and they presented the map, seemed perfectly reasonable. They presented the map which showed that Israel would keep about 60% of the settlers on approximately 2% of the West Bank. That they were able to carve out a neat map that both enabled Israel to keep more than half of its illegal Jewish settlers as part of Israel and preserve the territorial contiguity of a Palestinian state. And it was an interesting thing to read, for those of you who find these things sort of interesting, and I do, to read the transcripts of these negotiations, because you're almost a fly on the wall. You're listening as they're debating this map. And Tzipi Livni's comments were quite interesting. She never said that the Palestinian map was physically impossible. What she said was it was politically impossible. She said no Israeli official could propose this map and stay in office. But as a physical fact, they had, the Palestinian leadership is quite horrific, but they have some pretty smart people. They had some pretty smart geographers and cartographers who worked on the map and presented perfectly reasonable, I think, perfectly reasonable proposals for resolving the conflict. But what Kerry's proposing based on the Israeli bottom line is just a joke, and we have to be honest about that. The question then becomes, if Clinton failed, if Condoleezza Rice failed, what makes Kerry think he might succeed? When Kerry first embarked on his mission in July 2013, most people looked on it with a mixture of contempt and disbelief. I actually thought from the beginning that he probably had a fairly good chance of succeeding. Up until about a month ago, the opinion was beginning to shift towards Kerry would have a good chance of succeeding. Now the pendulum has swung back again to a failed mission. You'll be able to judge for yourself whether I'm right or wrong, but I think we're very, very far from failed mission at this point. As I said, Kerry, unlike Clinton, who you might recall, entered the negotiations in the last 6 months of his presidency. Same thing with Condoleezza Rice, the last 6 months of the Bush presidency. Kerry did it much differently. He started in in the midterm, 2013, midway in the Obama administration, because he knew it's going to be a long haul. It's going to be a difficult battle. It's still possible he'll pull out of it, but he still has plenty of time. So the question is, why did he embark on it? Certainly he doesn't want to bear the burden of what McCain called a trifecta failure. So why did he do it? The first point is the Palestinians themselves are facing unprecedented isolation. The Palestine struggle is a very peculiar struggle because for complex reasons, a place which, in terms of its geopolitical reality, is pretty trivial, has managed to galvanize both regional and then later international interest, and not only international interest, but certainly in recent years, a huge reservoir of support and sympathy. And if you go through the history of the conflict, and I'm not sure if people now want to, so I'm just going to go through it quickly. In the 1930s, the Palestinians entered into what became called the Arab Revolt against the British occupation of Palestine, against the Zionist colonization of Palestine. And the Arab Revolt was not confined to Palestine. It had a huge resonance throughout the Arab world, so much so that the British ultimately had to make major concessions to the Palestinians. Those concessions, as it turned out, proved to be beside the point because of events after World War II. But the British were forced to make the concessions because of the resonance that the Palestine struggle had throughout the Middle East. In 1947, at the time of the partition plan and then the first Arab-Israeli war, again, the Palestine struggle had significant regional resonances. One of the reasons the neighboring Arab countries invaded Israel in 1948 after the declaration of the state, one of the reasons was because between December 1947 and May 1948, Israel had already, it wasn't yet Israel, the Zionist forces had already expelled about 250 to 300,000 Palestinians, and these exiles, and they were going into Jordan, going into Syria. It created, again, a groundswell of popular support outside Palestine for the Palestinians. After 1948, one of the hallmarks of Arab nationalism that was presided over by Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, again, the Palestine struggle figured very much in the program of what was called back then radical Arab nationalism. Nasser, in fact, didn't do very much for the Palestinians, but as a verbal support and as a rallying point, it was quite significant. In 1967, after the Arabs suffered another major defeat at the hands of Israel in the June War, the Palestine struggle again emerged as a major rallying point and inspiration in not in the Palestinian areas, but throughout the Arab world. The guerrilla, to the extent that it was, which wasn't really very much, to the extent that it was a guerrilla movement, it aroused a lot of support in the Arab world, support for the PLO chair at the time, Yasser Arafat, and that culminated in the 1974 hero's welcome that Arafat received at the UN General Assembly. And then in 1987, again, now we're coming closer to the present day, so it may be clearer in the minds of people here, when the Palestinians went into revolt against the Israeli occupation, what was called back then the First Palestinian Intifada, or Intifada at that time. Again, it was a source of inspiration. It was a popular, most overwhelmingly nonviolent movement against the occupation, and it had huge resonances, not just in the Arab world, but by that point internationally. In 1974, when Arafat went to the UN, the main resonances were throughout what was called back then the non-aligned movement in the third world countries. But by 1987, with the First Palestinian Intifada, it was already having quite significant resonances even in the West, in Europe in particular, but also obviously on a reduced scale in the United States. But the fact of the matter is that the Palestine struggle now, it no longer inspires. Partly it's because the Palestinians themselves have stopped resisting, and partly it's because other humanitarian crises in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria have displaced it. In the past couple of months, I've spent some time in Turkey, and I also spent a longer time in Iran. And my professional area of expertise is the Israel-Palestine conflict, but it was very noticeable to me that neither in Turkey nor in Iran was I asked a single question about Israel or Palestine. In the case of Turkey, the only concern was Iran. It was a Muslim conference, and the main concern was how to stop Iran and how to revive the caliphate. Some problems with the water supply there, I think. And in Iran, the main concern, as everyone here can guess, was whether or not the current government in Iran would succeed in getting the sanctions lifted. And so for the first time since its emergence a century ago, the Palestine struggle has been reduced to its paltry geopolitical dimensions. It amounts now to little more than a provincial secession movement. And because the popular movement in the Arab world no longer, I wouldn't say no longer supports the Palestinians, it's just no longer focused on the Palestinians, it means that there's no real regional support for the Palestinians any longer at the state level. In the case of Iran, as I said, the main issue is clearly ending the crippling sanctions, and they're not going to jeopardize negotiations with the U.S. over Palestine. In the case of Palestine's other regional supporters, and I would put supporters in quotes, but leave that aside, the Saudis and the Gulf states have now entered into a de facto alliance with Israel with the common goal of trying to contain Iran's growing influence. For a while, Turkey seemed like it was championing the Palestinian cause, in particular in 2008-9 during the Gaza massacre, and then around a year later when Israel killed 9 civilians on the Mavi Marmara, the Turkish vessel headed, a humanitarian vessel headed towards Gaza. But Turkey obviously is no longer in the picture. It's cooperating with Israel in Syria and has lost, appears on the verge of a reconciliation with Israel even formally, and has lost interest in Palestine. So the Palestinians basically stand alone at this point. And the internal Palestinian picture is equally desolate. Palestinians are now divided between the West Bank and Gaza. It's not just a physical demand, but it's a psychological demand, a psychological chasm that's opened up between the West Bank and Gaza. For example, during the 2008-9 Israeli massacre in Gaza, there was very little support in the West Bank in terms of demonstrations or anything else. The people of Gaza, as we speak, they're being economically squeezed. In fact, you could say fairly, I think they're being strangled. They're being strangled by, of course, Israel. They're being strangled by Egypt. And they're also being strangled by the Palestinian Authority. The reason is perfectly obvious: to try to break the will of the people of Gaza so that the people of Gaza will rid themselves of Hamas. The strategy seems to be working. Gaza's economy is on the brink of bankruptcy. And according to most public opinion polls now, if an election were held in the occupied territories, Hamas would be trounced. The mindset of most Palestinians appears to be not a collective will to resist, but every man for himself. There's despair, there's depression, there's despondency, and Palestinians, with noble exceptions, pockets of resistance. They've grown cynical and given up on politics. The Palestinian Authority itself is hopelessly corrupt, incompetent. It survives by virtue of mass apathy, the fear to some extent of if the Palestinian Authority disappears, then we're going to have a new Syria situation or Libya situation in occupied territories. Then there's the dependence of about 25% of the West Bank population depends on paychecks from the Palestinian Authority. And then there's finally a quite effective apparatus of repression, quite refined torturers trained by the CIA and the Jordanian police. The Palestinian Authority in itself is totally enthralled to the U.S. and the European Union. There's all this nonsense that if you follow these sorts of things, every 3 or 4 months, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank separately, they produce these very hefty, precise, impressive reports on the state of the Palestinian economy. They even juxtapose the Palestinian economy next to that of other developing countries. The notion of a Palestinian economy is pure mystification. It doesn't exist. Indeed, how could it exist? Israel controls half the land in the West Bank, what's called the Area C. They control the critical water resources. They control all the imports and exports. The already meager West Bank territorial base is fragmented by a rat's maze of roadblocks, impeding the movement of goods and services. They control the tax revenues going to the Palestinian Authority. There is no Palestinian economy. It's perfectly obvious. And today I was reading probably the leading Israeli commentator. His name is Mouin Rabbani, and he was commenting on the recent claims by President Abbas that he's going to dissolve the Palestinian Authority, which is all nonsense. And Mouin Rabbani says, well, if he does, it's a real problem for us. He said, because that means there's 2.5 million Palestinians, and he says, and they have no economy. And that was an honest reckoning. If you read these silly IMF and World Bank reports, where they're comparing the Palestinian economy with Taiwan and Brazil, if the foreign subsidies were suspended, the so-called Palestinian economy would collapse in the blink of an eye. Put simply, Palestine hangs by the slenderest of threads. The EU and the US can sever that thread at any moment. And since Kerry launched his initiative, they have repeatedly threatened to do just that. And in fact, they just threatened to do that again yesterday when Abbas was talking about dissolving the Palestinian Authority. Immediately, Kerry and Obama said, well, if you do, there are going to be dire consequences. And he mentioned the US aid. The EU is also an important part of the picture because the EU position has always been an ambivalent one. Formally, in the United Nations and in various other venues, the EU has supported a fair resolution of the conflict based on international law. But on the other hand, the EU doesn't want to rile up the United States, so in practice it has done nothing to back up its words. But the EU, the Europeans in general, they've grown weary of this absurdly interminable conflict called Israel and Palestine, and they've grown wearier still of having to foot all the bills. And so now the EU sees light at the end of the tunnel. It may not be fair, but it would be, from their point of view, it would be an end to the conflict. And so now they have put the full weight of the EU behind Kerry, the EU, what's called the foreign policy chief, Catherine Ashton, she said several times now, she says that the Kerry mission is right now the only game in town. So the EU has been saying both to the Palestinians and Israelis, if you don't do what Kerry says you have to do, they tell the Palestinians, we're going to pull the plug, we're going to take all the money out of the West Bank. And they've told the Israelis that we're going to impose significant sanctions, at least on the settlements and products coming from the settlements. What the Palestinian Authority will do, I won't go into right now, I can talk about that later, but the fact of the matter is they have very few options. Their options over the years have consisted basically of two things, namely Abbas and Erekat, Abbas's sidekick, Saab Erekat, threatening to resign. They do it about 5 times a day. And also the other thing is to threaten to dissolve the Palestinian Authority. None of those things will ever come to pass because the Palestinians are just too dependent upon the United States and the EU and won't risk the consequences. As to the question, what's the most obvious question, and that's where I'm going to leave it off. The obvious question is if Kerry is taking Israel's bottom line and trying to resolve the conflict on Israel's terms, why does Israel seem to be opposing it? And that's an interesting question. Why does Israel oppose a resolution of the conflict which will effectively give it everything and the Palestinians nothing? So let me just briefly address that issue, and then we can take the questions from the floor. Am I doing okay for time? Yeah, okay. The first point to make is, like the U.S., Israel does not have a deep stake in ending the conflict. Historically, Israel has signed significant peace agreements or agreements when there was a major stake for Israel. For example, in 1978, it signed the signed the Camp David Accords, and then in 1979, it signed the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement. But it did that because it suffered a major military setback in 1973 during what's called the October War, or some people call it the Yom Kippur War. And Israel was very fearful that if there was a second round after 1973, they were very fearful about what the result would be. And so they signed the agreement in order to pull Egypt out of the Arab front, and therefore, at least for that period, no longer have to worry about a military conflict with its Arab neighbors. The second major agreement it signed came in 1993, September 1993, with the Oslo Accord. And there the reason was perfectly obvious, because for those who cared to listen at the time, Prime Minister Rabin was perfectly clear about why he did it. Some of you in the room are, a little bit on the older side, so you'll remember that first Intifada, which began in 1987, December 7th, 1987. And the first Intifada was a huge public relations disaster for Israel. As I said, it was the first time the conflict actually resonated in the mainstream of American life, because I remember I was teaching back then. One student, we were talking about the conflict in class, and he just stood up and he said, "Stone Uzi, that's not fair." And that's how the conflict was being depicted accurately in the United States. There was people who were, the maximum violence they were using in 1988-89 was stones, and even the stones constituted, judging from however people calculated, but it was like 15% of all the actions by the Palestinians consisted of stones. Otherwise, it was a completely nonviolent civil revolt. I lived there then, so for what it's worth, I'll attest to that. Even the stones were nothing, because they would just throw them at soldiers and could never reach them. It was purely symbolic. And so it was a huge public relations debacle for Israel. And also they were having a major problem because at that time, hard to believe, but you'd have to have seen it to really believe it. Israel is a very small country, and it has a civilian army, and also it's a large part of the army is only called up in emergencies. But during the Israel-Palestinian revolt in the first Intifada, there were people 65 years old. You saw them in fatigues in the occupied territories. It's a small country, and Palestinians out of control can cause a lot of problems, and they were quite sophisticated in that first and second year. And so the Israelis began to worry that all of their soldiers were involved in what was called at the time police duties, namely chasing Palestinian kids down alleyways. But they were supposed to be using their time to train for war. And their time was being squandered in these police actions. And so the Israelis decide, well, they did what you would exactly expect them to do. They decide, let's rationalize the occupation by finding an internal force to take over for us. And as Rabin said, and he kept saying it, actually he said it several times, he said, if we can get Palestinians to do the dirty work, then we won't have problems with human rights organizations, which was exactly, was a very shrewd thing to do. At that point, Israel's human rights record was finally, it took a long time, but it was now finally becoming part of the human rights record, and it was an atrocious record. It was, Israel was, as every human rights organization, Israeli and international organizations report, Israel was systematically and methodically torturing Palestinian detainees. And the figure Human Rights Watch gave was between 1987 and 1991, they estimate that several tens of thousands of Palestinians have been tortured by Israel. And so now the time was let Palestinians torture Palestinians, which is what Rabin said. And then our human rights organizations won't care anymore. And so they had a real stake in ending, negotiating an agreement with the PLO to let the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, take their place and do the dirty work. But things are a little bit different now. There's no real pressure on Israel to negotiate an agreement. The occupation neither figures on the international agenda anymore, and it doesn't impinge significantly on Israel's daily life. It's a very different picture for Israel now. Nobody talks about the occupation really until Kerry started talking about it. It wasn't a subject of international discussion any longer. And so now Israel has what you would call an unbalanced decision to make. And that means weighing the pros and the cons. On the pro side of the ledger, an agreement would enable Israel to finally rid itself of the albatross of the occupation while enabling it to keep almost everything it wants. It will get the 10% of the West Bank, which is really all it wants. It keeps 80% of the settlers. It keeps the water. It keeps the arable land. And it reduces the Palestinian state to a, you can call it a Bantustan, you can call it an Indian reservation, but it wouldn't last very long. It would soon have to confederate with Jordan, and the Palestine would disappear. Also, if they succeed, if they sign on to an agreement, it will normalize relations with the Arab world, opening up new vistas for regional trade, investment, and military cooperation. If they sign the agreement, it will enable Israel's fuller integration with the EU, its largest trading partner, and it will further entrench the U.S.-Israeli special relationship, because even in Washington there are large numbers of people who are growing tired, weary of the Israeli occupation. The reaction of the Israeli government right now, it's a little bit hard to gauge exactly what they're up to. Netanyahu has thrown two new items on the agenda. One is keeping the Jordan Valley, and the second is for calling on the Palestinians to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. The Jordan Valley issue is a very strange one, because everybody agrees it has exactly zero strategic value. Even if you read Dennis Ross, who's a complete apologist for Israel, even he acknowledges in his book, The Missing Piece, that it's very questionable whether or not the Jordan Valley has any strategic value to Israel. Exactly why Netanyahu is insisting on it, that's speculative, no point in going into it. The other demand, which is better known to most of you here, is the demand that the Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state. The demand lacks both precedent and it lacks rational sense. Israel, as I said, has signed agreements before. It signed that agreement with Egypt, the Camp David Accord in 1978, then the Egyptian-Israeli Peace Treaty in 1979. Nowhere in the agreement was Egypt asked to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. In 1994, it signed another peace agreement with Jordan. Nowhere in the agreement was Jordan asked to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. The Oslo Agreement, 1993, the Oslo Agreement was gone over very carefully by the Israelis. It had two parts. Part one came out in September 1993, and Oslo II came out in September 1995. Oslo II is 316 folio-sized pages. The Israelis went over every comma, every period in that document. Nobody even raised the question of recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. There were 6 pages of Oslo II, the September 1995 agreement, dealing with different gradations of Palestinian VIPs. VIPs 1, VIPs 2, VIPs 3, and then there was a 4th gradation. But Jewish state, it never came up. 2006, now we're coming to the present. Everybody here presumably remembers George Bush's roadmap for peace. That was also very precisely laid out. There's no mention of Palestinians recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. Then there's a logical question. How can Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state when no two Israelis agree on who is a Jew, let alone what is a Jewish state? What are they recognizing? The fact of the matter is, if we're honest about these things, the fact of the matter is, if Israel was truly invested in such recognition, there's a very simple way to get it. All it has to do is what Iran did in 1979. When the mullahs came to power, they renamed Iran the Islamic Republic of Iran. If Israel wants to be recognized as a Jewish state, all it has to do is rename itself the Jewish state of Israel. It's as simple as that. That's not facetious. There's no problem with doing that. The interesting thing is why they haven't done it. If Israel hasn't taken this step, it's because the 20% of non-Jewish Israelis would undoubtedly object, as would the small handful of the resolute Israeli liberals. And so you have this irony. All Israel has to do is rename itself the Jewish state of Israel. And when Palestinians, which if they've already done, recognized Israel, they're recognizing it as a Jewish state. Israel doesn't do it because it's afraid of the internal reaction. And so you have this peculiar irony of Netanyahu insisting the Palestinians do what Israel itself won't do. I think I'm going to leave it there because there's a large crowd here, I presume, of more than relatively knowledgeable people. Let me just then end on where we stand right now, exactly as we speak. As I said at the beginning of my remarks, many people think the Kerry mission has misfired and it's dead. I tend to doubt it for a couple of reasons. The main reason is the United States, as everybody in this room knows, exercises a huge amount of power. And part of the power is the U.S. can pin responsibility in one side or the other for the failure of the talks. And the United States pins responsibility on one side or the other. The side that's pinned with responsibility will suffer significant consequences. So far, Kerry has pinned the responsibility on the Israelis for the talks, and that's been a major problem for the Israelis, and you can see it. For anyone who thinks Kerry's poof speech was just speaking off the cuff, no. That poof was the most rehearsed line since JFK practiced for a day Ich bin ein Berliner. That was a very calculated poof. It was a way of applying pressure to the Israelis, and it was very striking that, to my knowledge, and I've asked some people to check it, but I still could be mistaken on the point, to my knowledge, not even AIPAC reacted to the poof speech. When the Secretary of State says poof, you better shut up. And he pinned the blame on the Israelis. And the Israelis are worried about that fact. The last time a U.S. official pinned blame was in 1991, when at that point the Prime Minister Shamir of Israel, he started to very aggressively and openly pursue the settlements in the occupied territories. And at that point, the U.S. was being asked by Israel for a $10 billion loan to resettle the Russian immigrants to Israel, and the U.S. put the loan on hold. And the lesson was very quickly learned. Shamir lost the next election, Rabin replaced him, and the consensus was it was just that action by the U.S., it undid the Israeli government, and Shamir was set out to pasture. So Israel doesn't want the burden be put on it, so it's probably going to do something in the next few days, because the deadline is the end of April for this round of negotiations. It will probably do something to make nice to the United States. And the Palestinians just don't have any options. They're going to do what the United States says. All this talk about dissolving the PA is just complete nonsense. It's never going to happen. So my guess is they're going to figure out a way to continue. And then a lot depends on what Kerry himself wants to do. Does he want to pursue it and risk a bigger blow-up, or does he want to cut the risks and end it now? I think he'll probably try to pursue it. And I still think, I know I'm a minority of one on this pretty much at this point, but I still think he has a pretty good chance of pulling it off. Thank you.
I know we have a lot of questions, and actually I had so many program things I wanted to talk about before we started. I forgot to do a couple of very important things, and it's to recognize some people that are important to us. And they're here tonight because they've been traveling. Jim and Diane Cameron are underwriters for our high school outreach, and so we always want to thank Jim and Diane for their generosity in that respect. Thank you very much, Jim and Diane. Well, thank you all, and I lost Norm. I'm not going to answer the questions. I'm simply going to repeat the questions. All right, who's up? We've got lots of time. Yes, sir. The question is it a little oversimplifying the issue to say this is really about American politicians' egos, or is there something bigger at stake for the United States, particularly with our relations throughout the region? I'm paraphrasing, but I think I've captured it.
Well, politics is very often of the moment. It's not always about looking at the bigger picture. And as I'm sure you are aware, and everybody in this room is aware, the Americans have a full plate right now. There are crises almost everywhere, and Obama himself, the expectation was he was going to devote the second of his terms to his domestic agenda. So when you consider that the United States has major issues now, what's called the Asian tilt, the issue of China, Russia, Syria, Russia-Ukraine, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. There was no need to add Israel-Palestine to that. There was quite enough already. And so the obvious question is, why are you dragging in now Israel-Palestine, where it's no longer an item on the international agenda? It's not a regional item. As I said, I personally witnessed it for whatever value anecdotal evidence is. Nobody cares about Israel-Palestine anymore. And so you have to ask, at this particular moment, with such a full plate, full table of issues, why did the Israel-Palestine conflict come in? And to my thinking, the only answer is, and there it's not just the moment, but looking at the record. Why did Condoleezza Rice take it up at the end of the Bush presidency? Why did Clinton take it up at the end of his presidency? There was nothing happening then which would warrant such attention. The Israel-Palestine conflict has lost its regional resonance. So in those terms, I think it's accurate, my description. It's mostly vainglory and ego. Though, you're probably right. If the conflict is resolved, obviously it will resolve a conflict that has endured for 100 years and at certain moments, as I said, has had huge international repercussions. But it makes no sense why they would have done it now. As I said, a year ago, if you asked anyone in this room, you think the U.S. administration is going to solve the Israel-Palestine conflict, people would have looked in bewilderment. Now, with all of Obama's problems, just didn't seem predictable.
The question is the influence of American lobbies, particularly AIPAC, but others as well, in their impact on American attitudes towards Israel and American-specific policy towards Israel.
I'm sure you're aware, and again, everyone in the room is aware, that this is a subject of very heated dispute. What and who determines U.S. foreign policy when it comes to the Middle East? My own opinion is I don't accept either of the main camps. If you take one camp now being personified by people like John Mearsheimer and Steve Walt, and I count John Mearsheimer as a very good friend and also a supporter during my difficult times. His basic view is it's the Israel lobby that determines U.S. foreign policy and has caused one debacle after another for the United States. And the other school, if you can call it a school, is personified mostly nowadays by Professor Chomsky, who I also count as a dear friend and a supporter in difficult times, who says it's basically U.S. national interests that determine what goes on in the Middle East, and Israel is a useful, as it's called, a strategic asset to the United States. I think each of them is half right. When it comes to regional issues, when it comes to Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, major U.S. national interests. When it comes to major U.S. national interests, the U.S. ruling elites, they call the shots. The Israel lobby plays at most, and not even really that, a secondary role. I can easily go through the record on Iraq, about which I've written extensively, but just to tell you the most obvious point. So Mearsheimer and Walt, they pinned the blame, the culpability for the U.S. attack on the U.S. attack on Iraq in 2003. They pinned the culpability on the Israel lobby. But there's one basic fact which you just can't get around. Every single account of the U.S. attack on Iraq, the build-up to it, the debates and so forth, every single account says that the main architects of the war were Vice President Dick Cheney and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. Bush, he was up in the attic with PlayStation 2 or something. He had very little to do with it. It was Cheney and Rumsfeld. Now, Cheney and Rumsfeld, they're extremely smart people. Don't underestimate them. I doubt anyone in this room does, but there is a tendency to assume that if you're a Republican, you must be stupid. No, Cheney and Rumsfeld were very smart guys with huge amount of experience in government. They started in their early 20s in government. They started under Nixon in government. So everybody agrees that they were the architects of the war. Now, Cheney and Rumsfeld, they don't give a hoot about Israel. They don't give a hoot about Jews. All they care about is, as they perceive it, U.S. national interests. So the idea that Cheney and Rumsfeld, in planning the war, were acting at Israel's behest is just totally loony. But then, obviously Mearsheimer and Wald are perfectly aware of this fact, and so how they try to get around it. They say it's true, Cheney and Rumsfeld, they were the architects of the war, and they are homegrown U.S. nationalists. They don't care about Israel, they don't care about Canada, they don't care about Mexico, they care about American interests. But Cheney and Rumsfeld say the second layer, right below them, Wolfowitz, Slutsky, Fife, all of those guys, they're Jewish, and we all know they love Israel, and basically they fooled, hoodwinked, tricked, manipulated Cheney and Rumsfeld. Now, you could say a lot of things about Cheney. You could say he's a war criminal, a murderer, a torturer, a killer. I wouldn't disagree with any of that. If you want to say he's the kind of guy who you wouldn't want to, find yourself with in a dark alley or babysit for your children or grandchildren, okay, I could see that. But stupid, gullible, fooled, no. That's not Cheney and Rumsfeld. That's just silly. The people who they put in those positions, Wolfowitz, Fife, Slutsky, the people who he put, they knew them for 40 years in government. They go back a long way. They knew them for 40 years in government. Do you think that Cheney and Rumsfeld are going to staff the critical positions in the vice president's office and the Department of Defense with agents of Israel? Is that believable? Is that plausible? They can size up the person in a blink of an eye. They worked with them. So this argument that the Israel lobby masterminded the attack on Iraq, among other things, is just not credible. On the other hand, I think it's perfectly obvious that the United States has no deep interest, no interest at all, in my opinion, in Israel maintaining its occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. So if, for example, tomorrow, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced, we are evacuating all the settlements, we're going back to the June 1967 border, and we're going to allow for a right of return for the Palestinian refugees. Does anyone here think Obama or Kerry would be unhappy by that result? Well, Obama is a stupefying narcissist, so he'll no doubt take credit for it if it ever happened. So the U.S. has no national interest in maintaining the occupation, which leads me to the conclusion, if the U.S. continues to support it, it's because of the lobby. On a local issue, where no major U.S. national interest is at stake, on a local issue, yes, lobbies have a lot of power in our country. That's why teachers are afraid to fail students, because they think a student will come in with a gun and kill them. And why are they afraid of that? Because of the gun lobby. So lobbies can have a lot of power, but not when it comes to a critical U.S. national interest. You saw it just as a little anecdote. When I was in Iran, there's all this talk about the Zionists, controlling the whole world, the Zionists controlling the whole world. It's pretty, I think, a little bit out of touch. And I was saying it's not really true, and I gave the basic same things I said here to you today. And it just happened that week was when AIPAC was trying to mobilize Congress to escalate the sanctions, which the Obama administration had agreed to mildly de-escalate for 6 months. And it was very striking what happened. Obama said, I'm not backing down. The AIPAC was stopped dead in its tracks. It's true, it got quite a lot of votes. I think it had about 48 at the time. But then it was stopped dead in its tracks. The more interesting thing was, and this happened just as I was there, so I felt like I had some good fortune in terms of politics. Just at that moment, Hillary Clinton came out. Now, Hillary Clinton, obviously, she's running for president, and she needs the Jewish money. They say of the Democratic National Committee, about 60% of its contributions come from Jews. So she needs the Jewish money. But what did she do? She backed Obama. She said she's against an escalation of sanctions. When that critical U.S. national interest came into play, and Iran is a critical U.S. concern, they follow what's good for, in their perspective, what's good for the U.S. And AIPAC was just dead.
What are the implications for the role of Hezbollah in the region, given what you said?
What are the implications for the role of Hezbollah in the region when they're not dealing with the Syrian government?
You know, the Arab Spring took many strange turns, as everybody knows. The biggest loser of among the biggest losers of the Arab Spring were obviously Mr. Gaddafi, temporarily Mubarak. And then early on in the Arab Spring, in particular, as events began to unfold in Egypt, one of the main champions of the Arab Spring was Sayed Nasrallah of Hezbollah, the head of Hezbollah. And he said it was an uprising for Arab dignity. He gave some quite moving and always, as he's always, insightful speeches. One of the ironies of the Arab Spring was that one of the main losers of the Arab Spring was Hezbollah and Nasrallah, because their alignment with Syria, not completely, but they lost a huge amount of moral authority in the Arab Muslim world. And so now Hezbollah is at a very weak point. Israel has many times provoked it, probably hoping for a reaction so it can go in and in 2 or 3 days' time turn South Lebanon into a parking lot. But Nasrallah is too smart to let Israel decide where and when. And so despite the repeated Israeli provocations, the assassinations, and other attacks, the Hezbollah has done nothing, mostly in my opinion, because it's now politically very weak. Enjoys its support has significantly, you can even say precipitously declined.
Yes, sir. 2 questions. One is you were easy on the Palestinians, not mentioning any atrocities, abuses, attacks, and so on. And so why is that? And then the other question is there a way to get the Palestinians to accept that there is a Jewish state, because that's a unique relationship, unlike Egypt and Jordan and others, if I paraphrase that correctly. We have 5 minutes.
Well, the first question, fortunately, this meeting is being taped, so you can check the evidence for yourself if it ever makes it to television. I was very careful about my remarks. I tried to be precise. When I refer to the fact that the Palestinians only threw stones, for those of you who care to remember, I said during 1988 and 1989, and I said explicitly about 15% of what was called nonviolent resistance 15% was, the figure comes from Gene Sharp, who's considered the leading international authority in nonviolence. And Gene Sharp wrote an article at the time, and he said about 15% of the resistance was using of stones, and otherwise it was just typical nonviolent action. So I was referring to 2 years during the first Intifada. On the question of torture, I think you got things slightly off. I never said anything personally. I was citing the human rights reports. And if you will recall, I said that Israeli and international human rights reports all agreed that Israel was systematically, routinely, and methodically, those are the words that are used in the reports, systematically, routinely, and methodically torturing Palestinian detainees. In fact, Israel was torturing Palestinian detainees from 1967. If you read Benny Morris's very conventional history, Righteous Victims, or if you read Tom Segev's book, 1967, these are mainstream Israeli historians, Segev and Morris. They both openly acknowledge that Israel was using torture against Palestinians. The first ones actually to document it were not Human Rights Watch, and it was not Amnesty International. The first ones to document it was the, at that time, newly founded B'Tselem, the Israeli Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, and they put out a report in 1990 referring to Israel's torture of minors, M-I-N-O-R-S, Israel's torture of minors, and it found that of the Palestinian detainees who they investigated, 90% of them had been subject to some form of torture or ill treatment. So this was the consensus finding of all human rights organizations. It has nothing to do with my personal opinion or personal predilection. As to what happened in Gaza, you can decide for yourself. In the course of the 22-day Israeli invasion, about 1,400 Palestinians were killed. Of those 1,400, up to 1,200 were civilians. On the Israeli side, there were 13 Israelis killed. Of those 13, 3 were civilians, and the other 10 were Israeli soldiers. Of the Israeli soldiers, 6 of the 10 were killed by friendly fire, Israelis accidentally killing other Israelis. When Israeli soldiers, and all the information comes from Israelis on this particular point, when Israeli soldiers were asked to describe what happened, one Israeli soldier said it was like a child with a magnifying glass killing ants. Another Israeli soldier said it was like PlayStation 2 computer game. So you have to ask yourself, a child with a magnifying glass killing ants, does that sound to you like a war or a massacre? That to me sounds like a massacre. And why should we be afraid to use words which accurately describe a situation if that word is apt? In the case of what happened in Gaza from December 27th to January 17th, what happened in Gaza, it seems to me, can be accurately described as a massacre. As a matter of fact, none other than Tzipi Livni, the night after on December 18th, she went on Israeli television. And she said, I told the Israelis to carry on like hooligans. That's her word, not mine. And that's what she said, and that's what they did. As to the second question, maybe your memory doesn't go back far enough, but it was not just the Palestinians who were accused of rejecting Israel's existence. It was the entire Arab world. Nasser was called sometimes the Mussolini, sometimes the Hitler on the Nile. Sadat, who came to be called, the great maker of peace, he was a sympathizer with Hitler during World War II. He was a sympathizer with the Nazis. So, if anyone should have to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, it certainly would have to have been the Egyptians. After all, who was responsible for the largest number of Israeli deaths in war? It was 1973, nobody knows the exact figure, but somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 Israeli soldiers were killed in the 1973 war. So if Sadat was sympathetic, not a controversial fact, sympathetic with Hitler, Nasser, his predecessor, was the Hitler on the Nile. The Egyptians cost the Israelis 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers. And if you recall, Moshe Dayan famously said at the time, before the 1978 treaty and then 79 agreement, he said we would prefer peace without, we would prefer Sharm el-Sheikh, a part of the Sinai, we would prefer Sharm el-Sheikh without peace to peace without Sharm el-Sheikh. They really wanted to keep the Sinai. They said the Sinai was critical to Israeli security. So then why didn't they ask him to recognize Israel as a Jewish state? That doesn't make any sense to me. And then the second obvious question is, what are you recognizing? If nobody in Israel agrees on what is a Jewish state, then why are you asking the Palestinians to recognize it? Does a Jewish state mean rights for only Jews? Now maybe you think it doesn't mean that, but you're surely aware that there are some Israelis who do believe that. There are many Israelis, if you look at the annual polls that are taken, they're what's called the Democracy Index, about 60% of Israelis believe the government should provide incentives, not for the Arab Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. The government should provide incentives for Israeli Palestinians to leave the country. About 60%, according to Democracy Now, their index. They ask that question every year. So, are Palestinians supposed to recognize Israel's right to rid itself of Palestinians? I didn't say it's saying that. I said they haven't said what it's meant. But it's certainly open to a wide possibility of interpretations. And unless the Israeli government specifies exactly what it means, it would be suicidal for the Palestinians to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Because we don't know what that means. Does it mean the right of Israel to expel the 20% of its population that's not Jewish? Now you say it doesn't. I don't know, because nobody knows what it means. Okay, sir, what does it mean? Do you know what it means? Aaron Barak, the former liberal chief judge in the Israel High Court, he was asked the question. He said, we haven't figured it out. We don't know what it means. So if Aharon Barak, the former celebrated chief judge of Israel's Supreme Court, High Court, if he doesn't know what it means, how can you ask Israeli Palestinians to recognize it? That just doesn't make any sense.
And on that note,